Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello, welcome back. This is Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, and today we're talking about books and writing and music and all sorts of stuff with Robert Lawson, based in Eastern Canada, but we won't hold that against him. Robert Lawson, how you doing today?
I'm doing really good.
And we're here to talk with Robert about his most recent release, which is Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who. So right off the top, we'll ask what inspired your interest in not only the Guess Who and their music and their history, but writing a full book about them.
Well, the two things kind of go hand in hand. I'm a lifelong Guess Who fan, raised on them, and I was just looking for projects to do. So if I write a book about a band, I need to be a fan first, because it means I'm going to be listening to basically nothing else but that band for, at least like 2 years or something. So it was just kind of, looking through my collection, figuring out what groups are there that I care enough about. But then another criteria is that there isn't already a lot of books out there about them. So for example, I'd love to do a Bob Dylan or a Miles Davis book. Those are like my two heroes, but there's already hundreds of books about those guys. So with the Guess Who, it's not like that at all.
And that seems surprising because they have been around since, the late 50s, early 60s in various, organizations and configurations, and really been recording since, I guess, the mid-60s when I first became aware of them. And so that's a long, long time, 50 years or so. So it's surprising there isn't, like you said, a whole lot of books about the Guess Who. So now, did you grow up in the Winnipeg area by any chance?
I grew up, I was born in Winnipeg, and we lived there, I think, till I was maybe 11 or 12. But then I was going back like every summer to see, grandparents and uncles and aunts and stuff like that. So I still feel connected to the city.
And they had a lot of music coming out of there that maybe the rest of the world, unfortunately, or even Canada, didn't know about. Neil Young was in some bands in Winnipeg before he moved to Toronto. The Guess Who had all sorts of various configurations. And one band I think you mentioned, you said that Randy Bachman early in his career was in a group called the Jurymen. Now, did they become the Jury from Winnipeg, who I remember from high school?
I don't think so.
Okay. The Jury, no. I've always thought was a great name, and they had a great song when I was in grade 11 or so. I grew up on the West Coast, but went to high school in Saskatoon before I went back to the West Coast. So the Jury was being played in Saskatoon. The Guess Who, or Chad Allen and the Reflections and the Expressions were playing around all the time. So let's go way back to the beginning of the Guess Who, and I guess their original singer was Chad Allen, original name Alan Cowbell. What do you know about him?
Well, quite a bit. You're right. He was the first. He's the original lead singer. They had gone through a couple of different names, but even when they finally ended up with the Guess Who, he was the lead vocalist for sure. And then what happened was the original keyboard player, who's a lovely gentleman named Bob Ashley, who I interviewed, he left the group, and he was replaced by this teenage punk named Burton Cummings.
Never heard of him.
So he... which is kind of important, because a lot of people think that Chad left and then they got Burton to come in. And in fact, Randy Bachman has told that story many, many times, and it's 100% false. Burton replaced Bob Ashley as keyboardist, and he started singing lead vocals on a few songs here and there, and eventually Chad left, and then Burton was able to be the full-on frontman, vocalist, and keyboardist. But he didn't replace an exiting Chad at all. there was a period where they were both in the band, and there's some fine recordings of that lineup, which is really interesting.
And just as a self-promotion plug here, my book, The Great Canadian Notebook, has a chapter on Randy Bachman, also a chapter on Chad Allen, who I happened to meet in the 70s when I was working at a station in Vancouver. So originally, I guess you go back to maybe the early 60s when we kind of had Bob Ashley, Chad Allen, Randy Bachman, Jim Cale, and Gary Peterson. Was that kind of the coalescence of the group in those days?
Yeah.
And then
so that's the lineup that recorded the first two albums, which are Shakin' All Over and Hey Ho, What You Do to Me.
And I remember an early song by the Guess Who called Clock on the Wall. Now, was that on any albums that we know of?
Clock on the Wall, that's an early Burton song. And so that was released, I believe now that's on, see, the first album that Burton appears on is called It's Time. That's from 1966. So that's the only actual album that has both Chad and Burton on it. But of course, by the time the album was released, Chad was gone.
And a clock on the wall keeps a pushing me. That's not the way I want my life to be. So, perfect description of somebody who ended up working in radio. We're talking with Robert Lawson, Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who. So when you were doing research for this book, Robert Lawson, did you discover something or a couple of things that you didn't really know about or that totally surprised you?
A few things. My research is always really detail orientated, so I like to really dig in there and find out the guts. And this was no different. There was a lot of it's often talked about when before Randy left the band, he kind of went on a medical leave for a little while, and I flew back to Winnipeg. The band were in the middle of a U.S. tour, so he flew back to Winnipeg so that he could see his family physician. And the accepted story is that they got some 17-year-old kid from Chicago who was a huge Guess Who fan and knew all their songs. And so they hired this kid to fill in for Randy for a few weeks. And that's just like the established story of what happens. It's just like a little footnote in Guess Who history.
Right.
But it was always sort of bothering me a little bit. Like there must be, like, who is this kid? So I tracked him down and I interviewed him. His name is Bob Sabelico, and he's currently a jazz guitar player in the U.S. And he just set me straight and said I wasn't a Guess Who fan at all. I rarely even knew their music, But him and he was in a band as a teenager, and they went to a Guess Who concert. They didn't have tickets, so they just stood outside and listened. And then when the band came out, they kind of made friends with Gary Peterson, and they even jammed with him a little bit. And then, lo and behold, a couple weeks later, Gary calls him and says, "Can you fill in for Randy for a little while?" But Bob was very honest about it, that no one ever, he wasn't a Guess Who or a Bachman fan or anything. He had to learn all that material really quickly and fill in for Randy. So just little things like that I like to really set the record straight, especially if there's rumors out there, and there always are, where people say, "Oh, I heard that this or that happened." Well, let's find out. Did it happen? Or because to me, it's not good enough saying I heard somewhere that Burton and Gary got into a fight. Well, I heard somewhere is not a good enough source for me.
Right.
So I like to dig just a little bit deeper. I was in a supermarket about a year ago, and a customer of mine, I manage a record store. So a customer of mine, who's a bit of an older gentleman, I think he's in his mid-70s, he's retired, he knows a lot about music, huge vinyl collector, big record collector. I've bought a lot of records from him. And I told him that my Guess Who book, I think it had just come out, or maybe it was about to come out. And the first thing he said to me was, "Do you know that back in the 60s, Burton Cummings and Jim Morrison used to have drinking contests where they'd stay up all night and they'd just drink for hours and hours until one of them passed out first. That's 100% false. That never happened.
Never happened.
Never happened. They met once, but this guy was under the impression that this was like a regular, like Saturday night thing or something, that Burton and Jim Morrison hang out and, overindulge themselves. 100% not true.
And this is Robert Lawson here on Talking Books, etc., talking about Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who. And we're talking now about research that goes into this type of non-fiction historical book. And in broad terms, I mean, something that was in the 60s now is, let's say, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. So that is history. What kind of tips can you give us in a long-winded way here for doing proper research? Now, you said you contacted this guitar guy. How did you track him down, for instance?
Once I found out that he was still recording, he has a website where he advertises concerts. Well, not anymore. We haven't had any concerts in a year and a half or 2 years. But he has his own website where he sells his CDs. Like I said, he has a full-time job. Actually, I think he sells instruments. But he has a website where he sells CDs and he posts YouTube videos of him performing in like little jazz clubs. And so once I saw that, because I didn't know if this guy disappeared into the woodwork and maybe I'd never be able to track him down. But it was actually really easy. I just did a Google search on his name and his website came up, which was great. And now I think just after the book came out, he actually contacted me and had me write a review of his album that he could feature on his website. So it's turned into a good friendship.
Well, that's good. And all the research, like how long was the actual segment that you put into the book? Like half a page or so? I guess what I'm getting at is you can do a lot of work. It ends up with a gem of information, but it might not be the entire book. It's just one little item that makes the whole thing very much more truthful. Is that what you found? Yeah,
like his portion of it, it's in the American Woman chapter. It's probably a page and a half or something. And there was a little bit of other information I got from him regarding the 1983 reunion tour. But if you look, there is one other book about the Guess Who that came out in 1995, and it's called American Woman, The Story of the Guess Who by John Einerson. And so if you look in that book, or if you look on Wikipedia or even some fan websites about the Guess Who, the reference to Bob Sabellico filling in for Randy Bachman will literally be just that. It'll be like two sentences. Randy flew home to see his family physician, and a local kid named Bob Sabellico filled in. It's a footnote, really. So with me, with my level of interest and research, it's a page and a half.
And I think, like I said, I think that's the key to a book that lifts the subject matter up above the commonplace. Because these days anybody can go on Wikipedia or a website and put out there pretty much anything they think is factual when it might not be. But you dug deeper, and kudos to you for doing that, for giving that information to us in the book Wheatfield Empire, The Listener's Guide to the Guess Who by Robert Lawson. And I'm speaking off the cuff here, so you can tell I ramble a little bit. You have other books, one about Nazareth, one about Cheap Trick. And speaking of Nazareth, I always thought they were bigger in Canada than in the U.S. Did you find that?
Well, that's 100% true, yeah. In the 70s, Canada was their biggest market by far. And they actually recorded a whole series of their albums in Quebec.
Tell us about your Nazareth book.
Well, it's the same idea where I go chapter by chapter looking at each album. I didn't really interview. I talked to a couple of the ex-guitar players, but I didn't interview too many people. I mean, it was my first book. I didn't really know what I was doing. But, I just kind of put it together with that same kind of idea of looking at every album, all the singles, TV appearances, radio appearances, bootlegs even, and just going through the entire discography with as much information as I could track down on these guys. And it was a great experience. When I look through it now, of course, it's a little cringeworthy for me because I see, things that I would do differently now. But, for a first book, I was real proud of it, and it did really well. It's opened up a lot of doors for me. So, it was fun. It was an exciting thing. It was a good project to take on.
Well, give it a plug. What's the full title of the Nazareth book?
So it's Razama-Snaz, The Listener's Guide to Nazareth.
And you could have called it This Flight Tonight, Nazareth Takes Off, but no, you're creative guys. And another one is Cheap Trick. Again, the same thing. You got an interest in Cheap Trick from listening to their tunes and carried on from there?
Well, technically, Cheap Trick were the first band that I ever saw live, because when I was in Winnipeg, I went to see Kiss on their 1977 Love Gun tour, and Cheap Trick were the opening act. So I'd never heard of them before. They only had one album out at the time, actually.
Yep. We saw them in Saskatoon. I was working in Saskatoon for a couple of months when they were out with Manfred Mann's Earth Band. They were on tour, and we saw them at the old Saskatoon Arena, which isn't there anymore. But that's a side note. So Cheap Trick, the same kind of thing? You went through the album by album?
Yeah, it's the same idea. The Cheap Trick book is called Still Competition, The Listener's Guide to Cheap Trick. And it's, the one thing I did with my first two books was I did interview a lot of fans. So I have a lot of fan accounts of important shows that they saw or things where they, maybe met the band or something interesting happened like that. And I kind of liked having that fan perspective in there, but I did not do that with the Guess Who book, because with the Guess Who book, I really wanted to concentrate on talking to as many people involved with the band as possible. So the Guess Who's a bit different for that I thought, well, we'll leave out the fan stories and try to get band stories. And I'll give you an example. When we were talking about research there, and we mentioned the original piano player.
Right.
So, he's another one that, it's like he's disappeared. You never, really hear from him anymore. And he left the band so early, like he's gone by the third album in 1966, but he's on all those old singles. So like when you hear the song Shakin' All Over, that's Bob Ashley. So I reached out to Mr. Ashley, and I told him what I was doing and that I'd really like to talk to him. And the first thing he said is, "You want to talk to me? Nobody ever wants to talk to me." and I said, "That's exactly why I want to talk to you. I want to talk to the guys who don't get interviewed as often as, Burton and Randy."
So when you do your interviews, what technique do you use? Do you record your interviews, or do you just over the phone with pen and paper? How do you work it?
It's really whatever the guys are comfortable with. I try to make it as easy as possible for them, because they're giving me their time. So whatever they're comfortable with. Some people prefer to just kind of do it over email.
Uh-huh.
So I'll send 10 numbered questions and have them broken up really nicely so that they can take their time with it, and then that way they don't feel quite on the spot, and they can kind of, some of these memories, like you're saying, these are over 50 years ago. So somebody might not have the answer right at the tip of their tongue when I'm asking you a question about a song that was recorded in 1965 and only released on a 7-inch single.
Right.
But but some of them are through Messenger. Some of them are over the phone. I thought Gary Peterson was over the phone, for example. But yeah, whatever they're comfortable with.
And this is Robert Lawson here talking about Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who, talking about his research techniques. Now, you're a self-published author, are you?
Yeah, well, I work with a company out in BC called Friesen Press, and it worked out pretty well with my Nazareth book, and so I just stayed with them.
And what kind of tips can you give for self-published authors regarding the promotion, the distribution, things like that you found out maybe the hard way?
Yeah, I got lots of those. In terms of distribution, Friesen Press actually takes care of all of the Amazon listings. So the author does not have to do anything when it comes to that. They will list it on Amazon. They will take care of all the fulfillment, and then every 3 months they send me a royalty check if I've sold any.
Right.
Now, then on top of that, I also buy a quantity of the books at cost, and so I can sell them to friends and family and stuff. For my first 2 books, we did book launch event parties where people could come, and if they wanted a book signed or whatever. With the Guess Who book, unfortunately, we weren't able to do that because all the pubs have been closed.
Right. So.
But for getting the word out these days, I think social media is so important. So I was never really much of a social media guy, and now my wife laughs at me that every day I'm checking Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all these things. But I do get a lot of sales that way. And there's different, there's some people who are on Facebook and they're not on those other platforms. So I feel I need to be on all of them and be reminding people of the books, because you never know who's gonna see it. And to this day, I'm in some Cheap Trick like fan groups on Facebook. The Cheap Trick book came out in 2017, and there's still people occasionally on there will post a question, which is, how come there's no books about Cheap Trick?
And you'll say, well,
right. So you got to keep hammering at it, because even with the pandemic, there's a lot of people who maybe were never on Facebook or Twitter before, but now they're sitting at home all day and they have nothing to do, so they've joined. So they weren't a member when I was first really promoting the Cheap Trick or the Nazareth book. So you got to keep hitting them up and make sure that any fan groups know about it. If there's any official or unofficial fan clubs, you got to contact all these people and just keep hammering away so that at least as many people learn about it. Once they know about it, they can decide whether they're going to actually buy it. But if they don't even know about it, you've already lost the game.
And this is Robert Lawson here with Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who. Also has other books about Nazareth and Cheap Trick. And your website has a different name to it. So tell us about your website.
The website is This Side of the Tracks .ca, and it's really where this all started, because I was reviewing albums and live concerts on my website, and even old horror movies and stuff like that. And it was finally from that I was getting such a good response from people about some of the stuff I was writing about on the website that a friend of mine who's actually written many books about hard rock and heavy metal, Martin Popoff, he read some stuff on my website, and he called me up and just said, if you know this much stuff about other bands, you should be writing books. And I hadn't really thought about it too much till he kind of planted that idea in my brain. So the website is the direct, genesis of me now writing books.
And the website is thissideofthetracks.ca, and this side of the tracks, meaning tracks that are on albums and cassettes. I thought it was something to do with railroads, so you got me confused there.
Well, it can kind of go both ways,
Robert Lawson, you have a record store. Tell us about that.
I work for Sunrise Records in Toronto. I've been with them for about 17 years, and so I'm a manager of a small shop. Of course, we've been kind of closed and opened as different lockdown rules come into play. But the store itself has been there for well over at least 15 years, I think. So we have a lot of really loyal customers. We're definitely the oldest original Sunrise record store in the chain, and we have a lot of people who've literally been shopping there for 15 years. So it's a nice little community, and people can always, when we're open, people can buy my books there as well.
Well, let's hope you're opening up ASAP. A little bit more about records as an offshoot. I heard that vinyl, of course, has been making a comeback for a couple of years, but cassettes seem to be the big thing these days. Have you heard that as well?
Yeah, people are kind of buying cassettes again. Some record labels started putting some stuff out. I think a bit more of a novelty item than the vinyl. I mean, there's Cheap Trick, actually. They had an album, excuse me, they had an album a few years ago that they released on 8-track. So, but I really think that's just more of a collectible item. Although not to say that people don't play 8-tracks. Some people do, but you're certainly not looking for them for excellent sound quality.
Well, I have a couple of cassette players, and I do like cassettes, but I've never even had an 8-track player. But I remember a guy talking to me, when was this, 1971 or something, about he just had one put in his car, and this was like the latest thing. So 8-tracks I don't know about, but cassettes and vinyl for sure, because who was it, the Ramones or somebody said vinyl is final. Robert Lawson, thank you very much for your time. Wheatfield Empire, the listener's guide to the Guess Who. You can go out and get it, and I advise you to do that ASAP. This side of the tracks is the website where you can find out all about Robert Lawson and his music, his movies, his records of indeterminate origin. He'll tell you all about that as well. Robert, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, thank you. Good talking with you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.